Silver on the Tree by Susan Cooper. Part 2, The Singing Mountains. Chapter 5, 5. Have we been here before? Barney said. I keep feeling... No, Simon said. Not even when I was little? Not even when you were little and I was a baby? You might have forgotten. Forgotten this. Simon swung one arm rather theatrically to embrace the panorama that lay spread around them, where they sat on the wiry grass halfway up the mountain, among spiny bushes of brilliant yellow gorse. Over all the right-hand half of their view was the blue sea of Cardigan Bay, with its long beaches stretching far into the haze of distance. Directly below them lay the green undulations of Abenduffy Golf Course, behind its uneven dunes. To the left, the beaches ran into the broad estuary of the River Duffy, full and blue now with water at high tide, and beyond, over the flat stretch of marsh on the other side of the river mouth, the mountain mass of mid-Wales rolled along the skyline, purple and brown and dull green, its colors shifting and patching constantly as clouds sailed over the summer sky past the sun. No, Jane said, we've never been to Wales before, Barney, but Dad's grandmother was born here, right in Aberduffy. Perhaps memories can float about in your blood or something. In your blood? Simon said scornfully. He had recently announced that instead of going to sea, he proposed to become a doctor like their father, and the side effects of this weighty decision were beginning to try Jane and Barney's patience. Jane sighed. I didn't mean it like that. She groped in her shirt pocket. Here, halfway snack time. Have some chocolate before it melts. Good, said Barney promptly. And don't tell me it's bad for our teeth, Simon, because I know it is. Course it is, said her elder brother with a disarming grin. Utter disaster. Where's mine? They sat munching fruit and nut chocolate for a contented space, gazing out over the estuary. I just know I've been here before, Barney said. Don't keep on, Jane said. You've seen pictures. I mean it. If you've been here before, Simon said, long-suffering, you can tell us what we'll see when we get to the top of the ridge. Barney turned, flipping his blond forelock out of his eyes, and stared up the mountains over the bracken and the green slope. He said nothing. Another ridge, Jane said cheerfully. And from that one, you'll see another. What'll we see, Barney? Simon pestered. Cadair Idris, Snowdon, Ireland. Barney looked at him for a long blank moment, his eyes empty. He said at last, Someone. Someone? Who? I don't know, he jumped up suddenly. If we sit here all day, we'll never find out, will we? Race you! He leapt up off the slope, and in an instant Simon was bounding confidently after him. Jane watched them, grinning. In the last year or so, though her younger brother had remained fairly neat and small, Simon seemed to have sprouted legs far too long for his body, like a giraffe. There were very few family races now that he failed to win. Both boys had disappeared above her. The sun was hot on the back of her neck as she climbed slowly after them. She stumbled on an outcrop of rock and paused. Somewhere, far away, on the mountain, a tractor's engine purred. A pipit shrilled overhead. The rocky outcrops led to the top of the ridge here in an erratic progression. Through bracken and gorse and billowing piles of heather, harebells starred the low, sheep-cropped grass, and little creeping white flowers she did not recognize. Far, far below, the road wound like a thread past the dune-fringed golf course, and the first grey roofs of Aberduffy village. Jane shivered suddenly with a sense of being very much alone. Simon! She called. Barney! There was no answer. The birds sang, the sun beat down out of the lightly hazed blue sky. Nothing moved any more. Then, very faintly, Jane heard a strange long musical note, high and clear. It was like the call of a hunting horn, and not yet so harsh or demanding. It came again, closer. Jane found that she smiled as she listened. It was a lovely beckoning sound, and suddenly she was filled with an urgent desire to find out where it came from, what instrument could play so beautiful a note. She went more swiftly up the hillside until, all at once, she was over the last rocky edge and could see before her the first few yards of the ridge or the hill. The long, sweet note came again, and on the highest gray granite outcropping they met the sky. That met the sky. She saw a boy, lowering from his lips the small curved horn, with which he had just blown a call over the mountains out into nowhere. His face turned away from Jane, and she could see little except that he had longish straight hair. Then he moved one hand in an automatic swift gesture to push back the hair from his forehead. She knew suddenly and positively she had seen that gesture before and knew who the boy was. She went forward up the last slope to the rock, and he saw her and stood waiting. Jane said, "Will Stanton!" "Hello, Jane Drew," he said. "Oh!" said Jane happily, and she paused, surveying him. "I can't think why I'm not more surprised," she said. "The last time I saw you was when we left Platmore Farm. When we left Platmore 4 at Paddington Station a year ago. More! What are you doing on the top of a mountain in Wales, for goodness sake?" "Calling," Will said. Jane looked at him for a long moment, full of remembering, thinking back to a dark adventure in a beleaguered Cornish village where her great-uncle Merriman had brought her, Simon, and Barney together with an unremarkable round-faced, straight-haired Buckinghamshire boy who had seemed to her in the end as alarming and yet as reassuring as Merriman himself. "Different, I said you were then," she said. Will said gently, "You three were not altogether ordinary, as you very well know." "Sometimes," said Jane. She grinned at him suddenly, reaching back to hitch up the ribbon on her ponytail. "Mostly we are. Well, I said I hoped we should see you again someday, didn't I?" Will grinned back, and Jane remembered the way his smile had always transformed his rather solemn face. "And I said I was pretty sure you would." He came a few paces down the rock, then paused and raised the horn to his lips again, tilting it to the sky. He blew a string of short staccato notes, and then one long one. The sound curved out into the summer air, then down like an arrow dropping. "That'll bring them," he said. "They used to call it the Avant." The note of the horn was still echoing around Jane's head. "It's a lovely, lovely sound, not a bit like the ones they use for fox hunts. Not that I've ever heard those except on television. That one, it's music," she broke off, flapping one hand wordlessly. Will held up the small curved horn, looking at it with his head to on one side. Though it seemed old and battered, it gleamed like gold in the sunlight. "Ah," he said softly, "2 occasions there will be for using, that much I know. The second is hidden from me. But the first time is now, for the gathering of the 6. "The 6?" Jane said blankly. "We are 2, Will said. She stared at him. "Jane! Jane!" It was Simon's voice, loud and peremptory, from over the ridge. She turned her head. "Jane! Oh, there you are!" Barney clambered over the rock a few yards away, turning over his shoulder to call, "Over here!" Will said in the same tranquil voice. And then there were 4. Both boys' heads swung round at the same instant. "Will!" Barney's voice was a yelp. Jane heard the sharp inward gasp of Simon's breath. Then he let it out in a long, slow hiss. "Well, I'll be someone," Barney said. "Didn't I tell you? Someone. Was that you blowing the horn, Will? Let's see. Do let me see." He was hopping about, reaching, fascinated. Will handed it over. Simon said slowly, "You can't tell me this is a coincidence." "No," Will said. Barney was standing still now on the rock, holding the small battered horn, watching the sun glint on its golden rim. He looked over it at Will. "Something's happening, isn't it?" he said quietly. "Yes," said Will. "Can you tell us?" Jane said. "Not yet, in a little while. It's the hardest thing of all and the last thing, and it needs you." "I should have known." Simon looked at Jane with a small wry smile. "This morning you weren't there. Dad happened to mention who it was that suggested we stay at this particular golfing hotel." "Well?" "Great-Uncle Mary," Simon said. Will said, "He will be here before long." "It really is serious," Barney said. "Of course, I told you. The hardest and the last." "It really had better be the last," Simon said, rather pompously. "I start boarding school after these holidays. Will looked at him. The corner of his mouth twitched. Simon seemed to hear in his mind the echo of his own words. He looked down, scuffing at the grass with one foot. Well, he said, my holidays will be even more difficult from the others. So we may as well not be going to the same places all the time, right, Jane? He turned in appeal to his sister, then paused. Jane! Jane was gazing past him, eyes wide and fixed. She was seeing now nothing but a figure on the mountain, a figure standing, looking at them, outlined by the blazing light of the high summer sun. It stood slim and straight. Its hair was like a silver flame. She had a sudden extraordinary sense of great rank, of high and natural degree, almost as if she were in the presence of a king. For a moment, she resisted a strong irrational impulse to curtsy. Will, she said softly without turning her head. Then there were 5, Will. Will's voice came strong and casual, and eminently normal, snapping the tension. Hey, Bran! Over here, Bran! He pronounced the name with a long vowel, Jane noticed, like the sound inside farm or barn. She had never heard a name like it before. She had never seen anyone like this before. The boy on the skyline came slowly down toward them. Jane stared at him, hardly breathing. She could see him clearly now. He wore a white sweater and black jeans, with dark glasses over his eyes. There was no color in him anywhere. His skin had a strange pale translucence. His hair was quite white, so were his eyebrows. He was not merely blond, as her brother Barney was blond, with his mop of yellowish hair falling over a sun-browned face. This boy seemed almost crippled by his lack of color. Its absence hit the eyes as hard as if an arm or a leg had been missing, and then he pulled off his glasses as he drew level with them, and she saw that after all the lack was not total. She saw his eyes, and they too were like nothing she had seen before. They were yellow, tawny, flecked with gold, like the eyes of an owl. They blazed at her, bright as new coins. She felt a sense of challenge, and then she was conscious of her staring. And though she would never normally have shaken hands with anyone her own age, in a kind of apology, she thrust her hand toward him. Hello, she said. Will said at once, beside her matter-of-fact, That's Bran Davies. Bran, this is Jane Drew, and Simon. He's the big one, and Barney. The white-haired boy took Jane's hand, briefly, awkwardly, and nodded at Barney and Simon. Pleased to meet you. He sounded very Welsh. Bran lives in one of the houses on my uncle's farm, Will said. You have an uncle down here? Barney's voice was high with astonishment. Well, actually, he isn't my real uncle, Will said cheerfully. Adopted. He's married my mum's best friend. Comes to the same thing. Like you and Merriman. Or is he your real great-uncle? I've never really known, Simon said. He probably isn't, Jane said, considering. Barney said politely. Barney said pertly. Considering what? You know perfectly well. She was uneasily conscious of Bran silently listening. Yes, Barney said. He handed the small gleaming horn back to Will. Instantly, Bran's cold, golden eyes were on it. Then, up glaring at Barney. Fierce, accusing. Was that you blowing the horn? Will said quietly. No, of course not. It was me. Calling. Like I said, calling you and them. And we will pause there.